So today we want to put together our MP curve, our IS curve, into our aggregate demand curve, face that with our long-run and short-run aggregate supply curves. That will give us a complete model, and then we can start thinking about how this model actually operates. What we'll see is this is a fairly good model for explaining economic fluctuations if, in fact, you know what the shocks to the economy are. It's also an interesting model in the sense that it shows us how the economy adjusts over time in the short run. So we're not talking about the kind of time period that the solo growth model would be looking at, which would be 10 years or something longer than that. We're probably talking here about something that would happen inside of 5 years. So we're going to be looking at this today. We'll talk about a few things, especially when the economy is not in equilibrium, how we get back to equilibrium. And then on Tuesday of next week, we'll look at a bunch of examples of various kinds of shocks. And we'll see how the economy reacts immediately as well as subsequently. And then that'll give us, as I mentioned, a relatively good model for thinking about how business fluctuations come about. So let's just review very quickly. We have an aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve is the inverse relationship between inflation and economic output. In this case, economic output is our endogenous variable. Our endogenous variable. So what we're saying with the aggregate demand curve is how does economic output change when there's a change in inflation? Now, we've talked about this before. When inflation changes, the central bank increases the real interest rate along the monetary policy curve. That higher real interest rate then slides us back along the IS curve to a higher real interest rate level, but also a lower level of economic output. So that's the rationale or motivation for this inverse relationship. So if we put inflation on the vertical axis, economic output on the horizontal axis, our aggregate demand curve will be downward sloping. It's as simple as that. Again, just remember that all we're saying is when inflation goes up, the real interest rate will rise. Higher real interest rate increases the cost of borrowing. There will be less borrowing, and that also means there will be fewer expenditures. Fewer expenditures means less economic output. That's what this aggregate demand curve shows us. And that's what that slide says. Now, it's also important to keep in mind all the factors that can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. Now, remember, the aggregate demand curve shifts whenever there is a shift in either the IS curve or the MP curve, right? Either one of those. And if you remember in the IS curve formulation, there were lots of exogenous variables. So a change in any one of those exogenous variables will cause the IS curve to shift and also cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. So remember, we had a consumption function. So we have autonomous consumption. We have a planned investment function. So changes in autonomous investment. We have a government purchases function, so changes in autonomous government purchases. Our net export function had autonomous net exports, and also as an exogenous variable, at least an exogenous variable for now, foreign and real economic activity. All of these factors influence the IS curve and also, therefore, the aggregate demand curve. Notice that in each one of these, we've got a plus sign after it, indicating that if this variable increases in value, economic output will also increase in value. We would represent that with a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Other variables that will shift the aggregate demand curve include changes in autonomous taxes, which influences disposable income and, through the marginal propensity to consume, consumer expenditures. Changes in financial frictions, which changes the interest rate that businesses borrow at relative to the real interest rate that the central bank sets. We also have the real exchange rate, which for now we're going to treat as an exogenous variable. We will make it endogenous later, but we'll wait for that to come about. So these three variables also shift the IS curve. But notice that after each one of these three, we have a minus sign. Increases in any one of these three actually lead to a decline in economic output. The aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. Finally, we have changes in autonomous monetary policy. So when the central bank decides to change R bar, then the monetary policy curve will shift, and that will in turn cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve. We also have a minus sign following this. An increase in the real interest rate, autonomous real interest rate, will cause less borrowing, less spending, less economic output, a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. So again, it's important to keep these 9 variables in mind and how, if they change, what happens to the aggregate demand curve. It will also be helpful to remember what happens to the IS curve or the MP curve, because as you know, we're using all 3 of those curves at the moment. Also, just to make sure that the list of things that you have to remember is really, really long, that many of these autonomous variables actually have subcomponents. Right? So autonomous consumption also includes changes in wealth, changes in consumer optimism, changes in expected future income. Autonomous investment also includes changes in business optimism, changes in the expected cash flow or profits of a business, changes in technology, narrowly defined. Technology is technology, not as total factor productivity. So we need to remember the things that are underneath these autonomous variables as well. So any of those changes then will change or cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. So let's take a quick example here. Let's suppose that, as happened in 2008, there was a big increase in financial frictions. The failure of Lehman Brothers in the middle of September of 2008 led to a massive disruption of flows in the financial market. Lenders were very unsure about the creditworthiness of borrowers. As a result, they wanted to charge higher real interest rates, even though the Federal Reserve brought real interest rate down. Right? So what we saw is the central bank was actually easing. Change in our bar was actually negative, but the credit spread, or the default premium, the difference between the real interest rate that businesses borrow at and the real interest rate that the central bank sets widened out significantly. So that was an increase, what we call an increase in financial frictions. The result of that means that there will be less borrowing because the interest rate that businesses face has gone up. That being the case, there would be less borrowing, less investment spending. The IS curve and the aggregate demand curve would both shift to the left. Now, if, this is only an if, it's not true, but if the inflation rate would not change with that shift, then we can easily see that economic output will go down. So economic output falls at any given inflation with this increase in financial frictions. Now, our second relationship is our long-run aggregate supply curve. The long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical relationship between inflation and potential economic output. Relationship between inflation and potential economic output. Now, remember this is a long-run aggregate supply curve. There are a couple of things we know about the long run. In the long run, the model is always in equilibrium. In the long run, the classical dichotomy holds. So we will have complete wage and price flexibility. In other words, wages and prices will adjust so that we're always in that long-run equilibrium. So what we have then is this vertical relationship at potential output, our long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, the endogenous variable in our long-run aggregate supply curve is potential economic output. Our exogenous variables include the size of the labor force, the capital stock, the level of total factor productivity, the efficiency with which the labor market operates, as measured by the natural rate of unemployment. It does not include inflation. So even though we draw this diagram in our inflation economic output space, inflation does not affect potential output. Long run, classical dichotomy. Nominal variables, like inflation, have no effect on real variables like potential economic output. This is why it's vertical. So notice then that we could have a very high level of inflation and still be on the long-run aggregate supply curve. Or we could have a low level of inflation. We would still be on the long-run aggregate supply curve. So inflation has nothing to do with potential economic output. Potential economic output will depend upon our quantity of labor, our quantity of capital, total factor productivity, and the efficiency with which the labor market operates. This is all derived from the production function analysis that we did way back, I think, on the third or fourth lecture that we had. And as you recall, the three variables that were in our production function were labor, capital, and total factor productivity. If we had increases in any of those variables, we would get an increase in potential economic output. So we need to consider that as a way of shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve. There is one other thing, and we talked about this on Tuesday, and this has to do with the efficiency with which the labor market operates. How easy or difficult is it for job seekers and job openings to be matched? Now, we talked on Tuesday that at any given time, this is measured by the natural rate of unemployment. If this job matching becomes less efficient, the natural rate of unemployment would rise. If it becomes more efficient, the natural rate of unemployment falls. But notice that a higher natural rate of unemployment means for any given labor force size, we would actually have less employment. Less employment through our production function means less economic output. The size of the labor force hasn't changed, only the percentage of the labor force that is actually employed. That's why we have this minus sign after our change in the natural rate of unemployment. So, as a way of showing this, suppose that, this will be a very hypothetical example, suppose that we have significant immigration reform in the United States. So hopefully you know that's only a hypothetical, not likely to happen in the real world. And we do that in a way that we encourage a lot of foreign working age adults to come to the country. And so this would lead to an increase in the size of the labor force. With a larger labor force, we should be able to produce more economic output, so potential output would rise, and our long-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Now, our third relationship is our short-run aggregate supply curve. In the short-run aggregate supply curve, we have a positive relationship between inflation and the level of economic output. Now, remember, our aggregate demand curve, economic output was our endogenous variable. For our short-run aggregate supply curve, inflation is our endogenous variable. Remember, the equation that we have for the short-run aggregate supply curve is that inflation, this time period, is equal to expected inflation, this time period, plus some function of the output gap, the current output gap, plus any price or supply shocks that may occur. And we made the assumption that expected inflation this time period was equal to actual inflation in the prior year, T minus 1. So actual inflation is our endogenous variable. So notice we've got a demand curve where economic output is endogenous and a supply curve where inflation is endogenous. That short-run aggregate supply curve has a positive slope. We can see that in our equation because we've got economic output right here in our output gap times gamma with a plus sign. So inflation and economic output will be positively related, upward sloping. Now remember, when we draw this short-run aggregate supply curve, we need to know what our expected inflation rate is. I'm just going to call it for now pi naught. But we have this upward slope. Okay. So one of the questions that arises is, why is the short-run aggregate supply curve upward sloping? So one way of thinking about it is that as economic output rises, businesses need to produce more output. In order to produce more output, they need to hire more inputs, labor, raw materials, all the other inputs that are in the production process. If all businesses are trying to increase their inputs, then the way that they will need to attract them to their businesses is by offering higher prices. Higher prices then will translate into higher inflation. So it's the demand in the economy that is driving the higher prices that we actually see. We're basically increasing the cost of production. Now, the short-run aggregate supply curve can indeed shift, as we saw last time, if there was a change in expected inflation or in price or supply shocks. Either of these two would cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. If expected inflation goes up, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up. If there's a price shock that raises inflation directly, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up. These are direct shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve. It will also be the case that an output gap will cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. However, an output gap does not cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift directly, only indirectly. And we'll see how this works out a little bit later today. Now, we should be able to see that because we can already see that economic output rises, actual inflation will increase, but it actually increases along the monetary policy curve, short-run aggregate supply curve. So when we think contemporaneously, if output was at y naught, inflation at pi naught, and then for some reason economic output goes up to y1, inflation will also rise. But in this case, the increase in inflation is not because the short-run aggregate supply curve has shifted, but rather because we've moved up along the short-run aggregate supply curve. There will, however, because of this effect, eventually be a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. That's why I say an output gap causes an indirect shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, not a direct one. So it does not happen in the same time period or the same year. So let's suppose that there's some sort of price shock. Now, the easy way to think of price shocks is to think about anything that affects the cost of production, anything that affects the cost of doing business that is not related to inflation expectations or to the level of economic activity or unemployment, away from the labor market, away from the output gap, away from expected inflation. So this could be due to a sudden large change in oil prices. Oil is used in lots and lots of different production and transportation and packaging. So big changes in oil prices can lead to substantial price shocks. It might also be due to agricultural difficulties. So if there was a big drought, again, maybe a hypothetical, it's supposed to rain tomorrow, so I'm sure the drought's over. Yeah, right. So if there's a big drought, agricultural production will fall, prices will rise. If it's substantial enough, it could lead to higher inflation. But we might also see things like government regulations. It has been argued that government regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley or the Dodd-Frank financial regulation bills increase the cost of doing business, independent of what's happening in the labor market or inflationary expectations. To the extent that it's true and it's significant, we can treat that as a price shock and see what would happen to the short-run aggregate supply curve. And you might be able to think of a number of other kinds of price shocks as well. So in this case, what we would see is that the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift up. And at least in this first time period, there would be no change in expected inflation from this particular shift. Now, I was asked earlier, why do we sometimes talk about shifts up and down, and other times talk about shifts left and right? Because depending upon how you look at it, any shift up or down could also be translated into a left or right shift. Right? So on a short-run aggregate supply curve, we could say this is an upward shift, or we could say this is a leftward shift. Right? We get exactly the same. The language that we typically use, however, is to talk about the direction that the variable we're most interested in discussing is changing. So notice with the short-run aggregate supply curve, what we're most interested in talking about is inflation. Inflation goes up. The curve shifted up. Think about the monetary policy curve. Right? It also had a positive relationship between inflation and the real interest rate. What were we most concerned about there? What the central bank was doing with the real interest rate. That's on the vertical axis. So we have a tendency to talk about shifts in the monetary policy curve is up and down. Now think about the IS curve, downward sloping. Right? So with the IS curve, what are we most interested in talking about?